This is an overview of an instructional design and a little bit about how people learn. I often say that I have a magic bullet in my classes, that it's the answer to almost all the questions. It underlies everything we do in education. And the magic bullet is because it helps students learn. If I ever ask you a question you can't answer and you're seeking for some way to answer it, try because it helps students learn, because that's why we do everything we do. Instructional design is kind of like a GPS. It helps us to identify how to get from where we are to where we want to be. Good instructional design can also help us find the best way to get there. Like a GPS, it can tell us where to anticipate problems, and sometimes if we need to go a different direction, it may tell us that as well. Curriculum is a cyclical process. We plan, but we're always waiting for a way to revise. So we plan, we teach, we assess how well our plan is working, and then we plan again using what we've learned from the teaching experience. So it's never a dead process. It's ongoing and cyclical. Let's look at some of the models of how people learn. There are many, many models about how people learn, and all of them are analogies. None of them tell us exactly what's going on because the brain is so complicated. There's physical models of the brain, there's chemical models of the brain, there's electrical models of the brain, cognitive models. And so looking at different models can sometimes help us understand what's going on in the process of learning and thus understand our students and how they learn. The two that I'm going to discuss with you, I like them because I think they have a lot to do to inform us about teaching and learning. So I'm kind of modeling for you the planning process. What is the big idea of this lesson that I'm teaching you today? The big idea is the physical and cognitive processes of the brain determine learning, recall, and use of knowledge. The enduring understandings, what I want you to understand and continue to understand, is that the brain works in a predetermined way during learning. And the most effective teaching is consistent with the physical nature and cognitive processes of the brain. So, essential questions are things that I want to discuss during the lesson, but that we may not, I'm not going to assess them. These are things that I want you to understand, and the questions will help you understand them. What happens in the brain during learning? What happens in the brain when information is recalled or applied? Because this really underlies the whole process of teaching and learning, is understanding these things. Okay, what knowledge do I want you to get out of these lessons? I want you to know how neurons, the brain cells, grow and develop, and how different experience affect neuron growth, because neuron growth is essentially what learning is. And so how do we make neurons grow? I want you to know how information enters the brain and the different ways information can be stored in the brain. I want you to know the factors involved in recall or application. These are some terms, some vocabulary terms that you will need to know the meaning of. Metacognition, constructivism, brain-based instruction, active learning, transfer, and understanding by design. What skills do I want you to be able to do? I want you to be able to read resources and find the information that is relevant to what we're discussing, and we'll have an activity for that. I want you to analyze information from resources, to answer high-level questions. And again, this will be part of our activity. I want you to apply information about specific terms to teaching and learning. So what does this have to do with teaching and learning? Has this ever happened to you? You teach, and you teach well. You know you taught it well. And the students are out there and they look receptive, and you ask them questions and they seem to know what's happening. And then it comes time to assess it, and nobody knows what you've taught, or few people know what you've taught. And you're confused, and you think, wait a minute, I know I taught that well. And yet it's gone. It didn't happen. And you're very disappointed. So let's look and see what's going on. This is the cognitive model, and I deliberately did not put it on top of a brain picture because it's not in any particular place in the brain. It's a process. It's what's happening as impulses go bouncing around your brain. What's going on? The first thing is information getting into the brain. We are constantly bombarded with stimuli, with sights, with sounds, with smells, tastes. Thousands of different stimuli hit us at one time. We are not conscious of all of it. If we were, we couldn't think, we couldn't function. There's too much out there. So what the brain does is it filters out most of the stimuli hitting us and only lets in what it thinks is important. So what does that tell us about teaching and learning? That engaging students and helping them focus on what's important to begin with is the first step in teaching and learning. Teachers can help students engage and focus on what is important. So we get it into short-term memory or working memory. They're the same. And it can only stay there a few seconds. That's right, a few seconds. That's all we can hold things in our conscious thinking memory. Now we can keep restarting it, just making it go round and round and round and keep it there for longer. But the brain has to make a decision to do that. If we don't think it's important, it will go right out in just a few seconds. Once the information is taken into our conscious thought and the brain decides to store it, it goes into something called episodic memory. Episodic means an episode, a vignette, a little tiny movie. Everything we learn first as a little tiny movie. And it will stay there as a little tiny movie unless we do something else to it. For example, if you think of if I had done nothing more than present this lecture, then it would stay. When you thought of this information, you would remember the classroom and me, and it would be one little bitty piece, a little movie, but it wouldn't be very useful to you because you wouldn't have taken important knowledge out of that and stored it separately. You wouldn't have concepts that are stored as concepts that you can pull out and apply in lots of different places. You want to take those concepts and put them into something called semantic memory. This is where unique pieces of knowledge, facts, concepts are stored, and they can be pulled out individually and applied to new situations. So how do you get it from that little movie, that little one-time thing that happens and is stored as a little movie in your brain, an episode? How do you get it from there into the semantic part of your memory where those concepts are unique and can be pulled out and applied? The way you do that is by experiencing that content, that knowledge in many different ways. In other words, what does that mean to teaching and learning? If we want students to really know information in a way they can use it again and again in lots of different ways in life, then we must have them experience it in different ways in the classroom and as much as possible in authentic ways. They've got to apply it. They've got to have to use it on new content in new ways. There's also a couple of other ways you can store information in the brain. One is procedural, and that's like to drive a car or play basketball or run upstairs. And how we do that is by practicing it over and over and over. Inferential memory is something that we get without anybody ever teaching us, but it's the brain going through these processes we're talking about all by itself. We're going to focus on episodic memory and semantic memory because that's most of what classroom learning is. It comes in as a one-time experience, but if you make students use it in lots of ways, in lots of contexts, it becomes semantic memory, where bits of knowledge, key concepts, are stored in ways that we can continue to use them. Okay, so what are the key points in memory that works? This is what we need as teachers. We need to help make students organize information, associate, and dual code it. What does that mean? Organize. When information is pulled into the brain, students have to connect it to something in order to store it. So, as teachers, we want them to connect in the right ways so it will be pulled out when they need it in the proper ways. How do we do that? By organizing the information when we teach it. Now we're talking curriculum design, instructional design, aren't we? We need to organize the information in clear ways so that students know how to store it in useful ways. Associate. That's where the storing occurs. How do we help students do that efficiently? This is where we deliberately bring in the appropriate prior knowledge, cultural experiences, and help them link that new knowledge. Dual coding is we help them link it in lots of different places. Dual coding means the information is stored in more than one place. As teachers, we need to deliberately help students do that. Okay, learning that is remembered and recalled. That's what we're after in the classroom. We have to get it into working memory or short-term memory. How do we do that? By engaging students. Episodic memory. How do we use episodic memory? Well, once it's in there, we have them recall it and refine it. We bring it back to mind as often as we can. Help them clarify misunderstandings about it and store it again. How do we get it in semantic memory where it's in discrete context? We have them experience the same content, the same concepts and knowledge, and as many different and as authentic contexts as possible. Procedure memory we do by practice, and inferential memory by exploration. Okay, this is saying the same information in different ways. What current research says, students' preoccupations are part of the learning process and must be engaged for effective learning. In other words, what are they going to connect it with? Their pre-learning. To develop competence, in other words, to be smart, students need to have factual knowledge. We often say, those low-level skills. They need facts. You can't do higher-level things until you have lower-level information. So they need facts and knowledge. They need to understand those facts and knowledge in context. We need to help them experience those facts and knowledge in authentic life kinds of ways, not just in books, not just in lists, not just in lectures. And they need to organize knowledge in ways that facilitate retrieval and application. That's where instructional planning comes in. If we organize the learning well, then students know they store it in appropriate ways connected to appropriate knowledge. And all students can be taught to be effective learners. Some students are going to know that when they come in our classroom. But don't think that those who are not learning as fast or as learning as well, they can be taught to learn faster and to learn better by effective teachers. Okay, now we're going to look at briefly look at the physical model of learning. We know that learning is a matter of making connections between brain cells and that the experience our students have shape their brains. What's the magic word on the screen? Connections. Physically, the brain physically makes connections. You see that long stringy thing there? Let's see if I can get a pin here. This long thing right here is a neuron. Oops, and neurons get fatter and stronger the more the same thing is repeated. If you have to say 3 times 3, you say 9. 3 times 3 is 9. The more you hear that, the stronger and faster that connection gets. But if we want students to think creatively and we want them to use higher level thinking, then what they need is this part of the brain here to grow. These are the dendrites, and they're the ones that make connections with lots of different nerve cells. How do we make them do that? When students process knowledge in complex ways, then they form these complex connections. In other words, when we have students analyze, when we have them synthesize, compare and contrast, when we have them create, when they do these tasks, then they are growing these dendrites and making lots of connections so they can call that information out in lots of different ways. So physically, how does the brain learn and remember? Practice learning makes dendrites grow along a narrow defined pathway. Drill and practice. Big fat neurons. Drill and practice. Dendrites are only activated by the activity that makes them grow. As teachers, we select the kind of activity to promote the kind of learning that we want to happen. In other words, they're going to remember it the way it was taught. They're going to use it the way it was taught. They are not going to remember it or use it if it wasn't taught in that fashion. They're not going to switch and use something that was taught with drill and practice in creative ways unless teachers help them practice that in creative ways. If we want creative thinking, then we want them to form multiple connections by providing lots of different experiences, lots of strategies, lots of times. If we teach something once and go on and forget it, students are not going to recall it and use it. Okay, a couple of quick other additions to how the brain learns. First is that the human body has two complete different nervous systems. They have the nervous system that works when we're relaxed and the nervous system that works when we're stressed. The nervous system that works when we're stressed prepares us to fight and run. It does not prepare us to think. What this tells us is that when students reach a level of stress, anger, confusion, when they are anxious, they physically cannot learn because the brain supply, the blood supply, and the oxygen supply to the brain is limited. It goes to the muscles so we can run, so we can fight, so we can save our lives. So Physically, human bodies are built not to think during times of high stress. They're rather react. So what does that mean in the classroom? When our students get too stressed, we can't expect them to learn. They're not going to. There's nothing you can do to make them. And so, of course, if they're asleep, they can't learn either. So the best learning occurs when students are engaged but not stressed. So what do when they get stressed? You back off because they're not learning. This is another picture. We went over this in the classroom. Different cultures see this picture entirely differently. In urban areas, they see a family in a house talking, and there's a window, and they're looking out the window at some lovely vegetation. In very rural, less developed areas, that people see a family sitting out under a tree, and the woman has a bundle on her head. In fact, in many cultures, uh, they know what the bundle is. It's a can of fuel because that's what a can of fuel looks like, and women carry it on their heads. So, what this tells us is that we don't even see the same thing. We see what our cultural experiences help us to see. And so, if we don't try to understand the cultural backgrounds of our students, we're not going to be effective as teachers. Um, Ways to build learning and memory, stronger connections, broader connections. And here it is, here's instructional design. Help students to focus, organize, associate, and dual code. We plan to do that. We plan to do it during instructional design. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I think you've got enough to